I read some really incredible books this month, so you should stay tuned to find out what you absolutely need to add to your TBR now. Hey guys, what is up? My name is Kaylee. Welcome back to my channel. I am here with my January wrap-up, in which I read 12 books, 5 of which were 5 stars, 5 of which were 4 stars, and 2 of which were 3 stars. So an insanely good reading month, especially one that starts out at the brand new year, 2020. And I think part of that is that I decided that this year I'm just going to read what I want. I'm not going to read the hyped books. I'm not going to read books that I'm forcing myself to read. I'm going to pick up and mood read what I want when I want to. And I'm shifting my focus, I guess I could say, to more adult works. I was very let down in 2019 with a lot of the hyped YA that was out. And thus I'm gonna, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm gonna screen them a little better when I try and pick up hyped books this year. That's my goal. Okay, let's get into what I read. Normally I go from least liked to most liked, but I'm just going to go in order of what I read because that's how I'm doing it. All right, first and foremost, I read Princess Jellyfish by Akiko Higashimura. This is the 5th volume. I'm slowly working my way through it. They're off screen. I have 4 more volumes to go. This is the omnibus, so it's a little bit, it's like multiple volumes in one. I was really stoked because I think the last edition, volume 4, I gave 4 stars because it didn't feel like a lot happened in that one. It was a little slow moving, but I feel like a lot more happened in this volume. There's definitely like a love triangle aspect that's happening. I can't give you too much information since it's the 5th book in the series, but you've heard me talk about this before if you've been around here for a while. There's a group of girls that are neats / they just aren't really fitting into the societal standards that are set for women, and they all have their little niche interests, and the building that they live in is being sold by the owner to build up a high-rise. They have an unlikely friendship with a cross-dressing man who is the prime minister's son. They don't know that he is a man except for one of the girls, and he is trying to help them take the building for themselves. They've started a business with clothing and they're running into a whole bunch of snags. As I said, there's like a little bit of a love triangle happening, and it's very interesting now that we're finally getting more in depth into the feelings and the mental workings of some of the characters. I'm really liking the dynamics and the friendships, the chaos that they're bringing upon themselves. And one of the things that I don't think I mentioned in the past, the storyline that I really appreciate is how the son that has the money, because his father is the prime minister, doesn't really live in reality. So he's got these big expectations of how things are going to work out and how much money people can spend and all of these things that like your average citizen doesn't have the ability to spend that kind of money. And he's starting to see how much he can be let down when things fail and money is lost and unrecoverable. And it's just fascinating. Everything's getting a little more complex, and I'm excited to continue on in the series. I absolutely intend to finish it this year, which sounds like a long time to finish 4 volumes of a manga, but we all know how our TBRs work out for us. So 5 stars. Really loving this series so far. Next up, I gave 4 stars to The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James. This was my book of the month pick, obviously. I buddy read this with my friend Jamie over at Jamie Reads. This is a thriller that takes place in 2 different timelines, back in the 1980s and then present day. And it all takes place at this one motel that's kind of in the middle of nowhere in New York. One storyline is about a girl, the present day girl, who has gone to this motel because her aunt went missing in the 80s from this hotel. Like, this is the motel was the last place that she was ever seen, and this girl has been obsessed with it, with the idea that her aunt went missing and no one knows what happened to her. So she goes to find out what happened. In the 1980s storyline, we're getting the view of the aunt and the things that she went through. So each storyline progresses linearly. It was a very good read. Like, I want to go back and read her other, Simone St. James's other published work, Broken Girls, I think it's called. I had it on my radar back when it first came out, but then just never got around to it. I really, really liked how this was written. I also did not expect the paranormal element that was in this. I definitely just expected it to be like your average contemporary thriller, but it definitely had a lot more paranormal elements that I really appreciated it sprinkled in through this whole story. It was a fun buddy read. I didn't expect the end to go the way it did, which I said before, it doesn't affect thriller's rating for me, but I really had a good time with it, and I will continue to read things that Simone St. James publishes in the future. So if you are interested in thrillers that aren't very detective heavy or courtroom heavy, just kind of like a contemporarily written thriller, this is definitely up your alley. The next two books I would consider my favorite books of the month. They are for a very particular reader though, but let's just get into them. Next book is Normal People by Sally Rooney. This is definitely a very wildly swaying book for people. Either you didn't like it at all, or it was a book written specifically for you, and I fall into the latter category. This is a story that is very character heavy. Almost the entire story is carried by characters. There isn't a very decisive plot that takes place that carries you through. This is a story told linearly about two people, their relationship throughout many years. It spans from high school past, I think, into their late 20s. They're both very, very different people, but they're both equally fucked up, both because of their upbringing, but also just because life is hard and tedious and people are complicated and complex. And that's really what this story hinges on, is the fact that no matter what, life is not an easy thing to get through. And because of who you are as a person, relationships are complicated, both friendships and romantic relationships. Rami, who I'll link below, was quoted as saying that this is a sad book for sad people, and I keep sticking with that because it definitely is a very heavy and depressing book. Definitely a sad book for sad people. This book, I didn't see it coming. I didn't know what to expect. I've seen people both love and hate it, so when I went into it, I really was like anticipating being on the fence, but it wormed its way into my heart, and it's a book that I will never forget. This is one of those books that I think even a decade from now, I'll still remember the story. But I can't give you much more than that because it's honestly, you have to read it, and it's not that long. So if it's something that sounds up your alley, if you really like character-driven books, give this one a shot. I'd like to read Sally Rooney's back titles that have been published already. I think she only has one, which is like Conversations with Friends, I want to say. Yeah, this book wrecked me in the right kind of ways. It also has a slightly ambiguous ending, so if that is something that isn't up your alley, if that is something that doesn't resonate with you in a book, know that as well. Maybe avoid this book, but I absolutely loved it. Shifting gears entirely from that is, well, this is also a sad story, so it turns out I really like sad stories. I read Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. This is a story that I really, really wanted to get to, but I was intimidated by the size. And I have this like ability, my library has a monthly book club, and somehow I always end up reading the book for the monthly book club the month that it is chosen without realizing that it's chosen. I walked into my library last week, or like 2 weeks ago after I had read this, and they had a whole display with like 800 of these copies, and I couldn't believe that I did it again. This is a generational story that starts out with a family in Korea who has a disabled son. You follow that family through generations. So that son has a daughter, and most of the story is about that daughter and her life. She gets pregnant, and then they have to, like, at some point in the storyline, they go to Japan, and all of the hardships that this family faces generation to generation, because it changes, you know, the society changes and new problems come up and new levels of racism or different levels of racism and expectations and hardships, both back in Korea where they're from, but a lot of racism within Japan. So you're starting the book in 1910 through the 1930s and then progressing to basically present day, I want to say. It spans up to almost the 1990s. So you get almost a whole century of this family's growth and their children having children and what happens. It's a very impactful book. It's very sad. I definitely cried a couple times, but I think, again, this is very character driven. So there are a lot of things that happen, but the main story is told so that you follow the family and the things that happen to them and how choices affect generations in the future. So the main character that you follow is the daughter of the disabled man that you first meet. Her name is Sunja, and she is the reason that I resonated so hard with this book is because her struggles, I won't say that they're the hardest in all of the book because everybody faces some really, really rough times, but hers is the one that resonated the most with me because it's about her being independent and raising her two sons and the hardship she faces as a woman in a society that is both sexist and racist, and the things she had to give up and do in order for her family to survive and thrive. You basically start and end the story with Sunja and her life, but it's not all about her. I feel like I'm not describing this book and giving it justice. It's just, it's so good. It's so good. This is another one of those books, like Normal People and Pachinko will 150% be on my top books of 2020. And the fact that I started the year with them, I do this every time. I find books that I absolutely love in January and it ruins the rest of the reading year for me. Read Pachinko. All right, next up is a book that I was nervous to read because Lala at Books and Lala talked about it and the synopsis of it and made me want to read it, but again, I was hesitant, and that is Miracle Creek by Angie Kim. This is a thriller. It's a courtroom, like legal thriller, which I'd never actually read before that I can recall, but it's a story about a family who comes from Korea and lives in the United States and starts up a business. They run like an experimental medical treatment that has to do with oxygenation, where people that have specific medical issues, and very specifically to this story, autism, go in and do like this deep dive oxygen treatment for an hour. They're basically submersed. Like you go in and you get this oxygen mask put on you, basically like a scuba diving helmet. And for an hour, you're like breathing pure oxygen. And it's an experimental treatment to try and help people with various disabilities like cerebral palsy and autism and like even infertility to try and help their bodies recover or get better. And the whole point of this story is that this tank catches fire and two people die, one of which is a very young, I believe he was 7, 8, or 9, autistic boy dies. So the whole story, ooh, I'm getting choked up and I didn't expect it, is about whether his mother purposefully set the fire to kill her son because she didn't want to have an autistic son anymore. So you don't know the whole time how the fire started. And it's told through multiple perspectives, people who were in the chamber that didn't die, the family that runs the business, as well as the mother of the deceased son. You slowly get to see her insight, and it was really hard for me, and I wept in unexpected places because her son really, really reminded me of my own, because he wasn't severely autistic, the boy Henry that is killed in this book. He is mildly autistic, and that's kind of used as a plot device for villainizing the mother. Like, why would she kill her son that really wasn't that difficult of a child to begin with? Was she really that crazy? Was she really that villainous? Like, down to details where like Henry has a missing tooth and you can see the adult tooth poking through, and like my son has that right now. It's just one of those things. For those of you that don't know, I do have a mildly autistic son, so like it really, really was a gut punch, and that was why I was very hesitant to read the story. I ended up giving it 5 stars. I absolutely loved where it went and how it unfolded and how it was told, and the turns and the reasoning behind everything. And for my first like courtroom thriller, I absolutely loved it. I don't think courtroom thrillers are a plot that I will want to read more of in the future. It's just not really my thing. But for this and the way it was told, all of the things that were tackled within this book between special needs children and how difficult it is for families, how they're not a burden, as well as topics of racism. And there was just a lot that happened within this one story that I don't go into thrillers expecting to feel the kind of feelings that I had and read about the kind of struggles that I read about. And it blew me away. And this is a debut novel, so I'm looking forward to what Angie Kim does in the future, because I couldn't believe it. I loved this book, which is a weird thing. Like it's hard to say I loved a book that was so hard to read. It was 5 stars for me. The next one I picked up on a total whim, and that is A Recipe for a Perfect Wife by Karma Brown. This is a story, first and foremost, I gave it 3.5 stars. I still think about it now, which is where the half comes from. When I read it, when I was reading it, it was definitely a 3-star for me, but because I keep coming back to it in my head, I'm on the fence. So I'm giving it a 3.5 star. This is a story, again, told in 2 timelines. Apparently that I had a month of timeline stories of a woman, modern day, who she and her husband have moved from New York City into a suburb of New York, into a house that she does not want to be in. She's a New York girl through and through and does not want to be in the suburbs. And you're also seeing, back in the 1950s, the storyline of a woman named Nellie who lived in the house at the time. It's really a story about feminism and woman power and how much has changed over time, but how little has changed over time. In the Nellie storyline, it's kind of cool. It starts out, first and foremost, each chapter, so you got Alice is modern day and Nellie is like 1950s. Each chapter starts with a quote that is literally taken from books that were published in the 1900s about how to be the perfect wife, and they're all very incredibly sexist and basically like, bow down to your husband. Your whole job is to make sure that his life is good and that he is happy. It doesn't matter what cost it is to you. Your whole role as a woman is to make sure a man's life is easy. And they're like literal quotes from books, and that was probably one of my favorite parts of the whole story because it's just so fucked up to think about. So each Nellie chapter, she's the 1950s wife, comes with a recipe at the start, and the whole story is based around the fact that Alice, modern day Alice, finds a recipe book in the basement that belonged to Nellie's mother, and she makes a lot of the recipes. Alice is not a housewife by any means. She's a New York City girl. She bought takeout. She worked a full job. She's lost that job now, and so they've moved to the suburbs to like save money, etc. So she's trying to find her footing being an unemployed housewife while trying to write a novel, but the novel's not going anywhere, so she kind of putzes around, finds this recipe book that belonged to Nellie, and there's like notes in the margins, etc., etc. So she starts being interested in what happened to Nellie. She's got all these letters that were written to Nellie's mother by Nellie, and she thinks that if she like finds out more, she'll have a plot for her story. It's really like the core plot of the whole thing. Nellie's timeline is hard to read. There's a lot of trigger warnings. There's a lot of like abuse and suicidal ideations and actual suicide, and so be aware that like that storyline is pretty rough. She also has a very abusive husband in the way that everybody in society, like when they go to house dinner parties, which happened a lot in the 1950s, she had to play the perfect role, and everybody loved him, and she was so lucky to have him, and but behind closed doors he beat her. So her storyline is pretty fucked up, but there's a reason for it. The reason I gave it 3 stars is because I felt like it drug a lot. There was a whole lot of information that was very repetitive. The storyline kind of went on and on and on without there being a whole lot of reasoning behind it, and the end fell flat for me. However, because I keep thinking of it, there's definitely a grain of something within this book that makes it worth checking out. If any of those plot lines sound interesting to you, specifically the whole idea of feminism and how it's changed and how it stayed the same, I would say it's worth checking out. I also would caution that Alice, the modern day character's choices, oftentimes didn't feel realistic. She made some really weird decisions that affected her life in negative ways that she could have easily surpassed or worked around, and that got very annoying. I didn't align with Alice as much as I aligned with Nellie, not because I'm like a 1950s woman who has an abusive husband, but because her strength and her character, it resonated in my heart more than Alice's story. Alice was a little bit of a crybaby in my opinion, comparatively. So that said, a book I didn't expect to read, and I don't think that I haven't seen a whole lot about this book, but I did see a whole table dedicated to it at Barnes & Noble, so maybe I'll see more in the future, but that's it. I also listened to A Man Called Ove by Frederick Bachman. This is my first Frederick Bachman novel. I know a lot of people really loved this as well as Beartown. I thought it was okay. I gave it 4 stars. It's a story about an old grumpy man in a neighborhood of, I think it's townhomes, and he's just a man that's very set in his ways. Like, he likes cars, but they have to be a specific kind of car. He likes his neighborhood to be watched and cared for, and no one can break the rules. He's just a very grumpy, mean old man. But it's a very sad story, and here's the thing. I was between a 3 and a 4 star because the storyline itself is very full of cliches, honestly. And the one thing I couldn't get behind, Uwe, his wife is dead, and he's still struggling to come to terms with that. And the whole plot line is that he wants to die. He wants to kill himself, but his attempts at succeeding in that keep getting thwarted by neighbors. And the whole part, so like that, I'm putting that out there for trigger warning, not to spoil the story. The whole part that was hard to get behind, that made it not even close to a 5-star book, is that I really don't think, and maybe this is a condemnation on society, that people are this open and willing to accept someone who's fucking mean, because the neighbors really pull him from the person that he is, this person who is lost and is grumpy and has always been set in his ways, and they just keep at him until he caves to their like open arms. And I just don't think that that's how it works. Like, I don't believe that someone that mean and grumpy from the get-go and rude is going to have neighbors that are like, you know what, let's just keep at him until he decides that he's a good person and loves us. And I say that because I grew up in a house with a neighbor that was this man, and he was mean to his core until like a year ago. Like, my parents don't live in that house anymore. But like, no matter how we treated him, he was still the same person. And so by the end of it, like by the time I moved out, the relationship between that neighbor and my folks was terrible. If they interacted, it was to yell at each other. He was a grumpy old man, and I don't see us continuing to be compassionate would have changed him. And there's a point at which you give up. And I just think that this whole storyline was built on the fact that people are better than they truly are. And I wish that wasn't the case, but I couldn't get it out of my head that I just think that there was too much effort put in to make it believable. But that's what the whole tugging at your heartstrings was about in this novel, was the fact that he did break down. He did become a nicer, kinder, more compassionate person because of other people's compassion. I liked it and I didn't like it because I didn't believe it, but I also thought it was it's what carried the story. And it did affect me because I did really care for the characters within the book by the end. It just wasn't the best. So I gave it 4 stars, a hesitant 4 stars, maybe 3.5. Next, I checked out because I loved the first edition so much, My Brother's Husband, Volume 2 by Gengora Tagami. This follows the same storyline. So if you don't know, the man Mike here is Canadian, and Yachi is this man here, and he had a twin brother who Mike married in Canada. This is Yana, their Yachi's daughter. And Mike comes to stay with them in Japan to get to know where his late husband, you know that he died way in the beginning of the first volume, grew up. And Yachi is kind of homophobic in the beginning, I will say. He didn't hate his brother because of his sexual orientation, but he still had a lot of just societal biases against anybody who is queer. But through the eyes of his daughter and through meeting Mike, he starts to realize that his assumptions are unfounded and that maybe it's society that's wrong, and he's very accepting, and just this carries on with the growth of Yachi, and you get a lot of emotion out of Mike, and in this novel he ends up having to go back home, and it really, the first novel was so good, and I cried in it, and a lot of things happened. It was a very emotional novel, and this too was emotional. I'm sad that there's no more, that it's not a longer series, but I don't think that there really is more that you could go for without just dragging it out endlessly and pointlessly, because the whole of the 2 volumes together is to say that you may have your biases, you may have your homophobic thoughts, there's room for growth and to learn, to grow, to realize that humans are humans and it doesn't affect you, and people deserve to love who they love, and it doesn't make them any different or any less. And I really liked how the author took both an adult character that needed that growth and a young girl who was very innocent to the idea that this is weird or different in society, and together they were the characters that I just like the dynamic of the 2 together and how it told the story that needed to be told, which is that why miss out on life and being in a relationship with someone like your twin brother because of this idea that you probably don't even have. It's just something that in society you've been told you should have. And that's really what the core is that think for yourself, know that people are allowed to be different, don't miss out on, I'm getting choked up again, holy shit. Don't miss out on family and love and life because of these biases, these negative biases. Wow. What is wrong with me? All right, we're gonna move on. Next, I read a book that I am sorry to say I did not love. I really expected it. I am reading a book from the same author right now that I can't put down. And I've loved this series up until the last book and this one now. And I'm thinking maybe I've just outgrown it. I don't know. But that is Come Tumbling Down by Sean McGuire. I loved Every Heart a Doorway. Down Among the Sticks and Bones is my favorite in the series, but I've progressively grown less interested. This book specifically follows Jack and Jill from Down Among the Sticks and Bones, so I had very high expectations, and I just fell short for me. Sean McGuire's writing is very beautiful, especially in these short fantasy novellas, and the overall idea that these characters, these wayward children, have these doors that open to them as children where they go into universes that suit them and their needs in that time is amazing. And the fact that they get kicked out and either find themselves longing to go back or trying to move on and live in society as we know it is such a great idea and so unique. And I love that we're seeing different like universes and worlds through these books. And I don't know if it's because we went and revisited one we've already seen that I lost interest, because Jack and Jill was were my favorites in the first two books. And in this one, I didn't honestly care. I had to tell myself not to DNF it, which is sad. I gave it 3 stars, I think, out of nostalgia. I know a lot of people really loved it. This series started in 2017, so maybe I've just outgrown it. I don't know. Let me know down below if you've read all of these and how you've been feeling about the last 2, because this and Beneath the Sugar Sky just didn't do it for me. So I don't know, maybe I just don't read these anymore. If I didn't say already, I gave it 3 stars because it wasn't the worst thing I've ever read. And as I said, I really like Sean McGuire's writing, and it's very beautifully written. I just didn't really care. Next, I read a book, a good friend of mine who is not much of a reader but wants to read more in this coming year, read this as the first book on her 2020 resolution, and that is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. It's a book that has a lot of hype, and I've seen it since it came out. It's always at my library in the hot pick section, and she gave it 5 stars. So I was like, you know what? If my library has it in ebook, I'm gonna check it out and see what it's about. I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. It's a story that starts with a very young girl who lives in like a swamp of North Carolina, and I don't know what year it is. It's like the late 1950s. And she's got an abusive father and her family. She's got 4 older siblings. Everybody leaves her basically. And she has to fend for herself in this shack in a swamp where the city people, like the town folk, call her Swamp Girl. They want nothing to do with her. They think she's gross and weird, and it's not at all what I expected it to be, because you've also got a murder mystery interlaid in it. There's again another 2 timeline story where one of the main people in town, the quarterback of the high school team that's now in his like late 20s but is still like the town favorite, is found dead, and they don't know how he's killed, and they're trying to find out who killed him. But you're also going back and learning all about this girl who's lived in the marsh by herself, and she learns to read due to another guy that lives and fishes and like goes into the marsh. Often they like run into each other, and he starts coming and teaching her to read, and then she gets really interested in learning about the biological goings on in this marsh. And by the time she's an adult, she's like an expert on it. They have a little thing, and then I'm trying to say this without spoilers. What I really loved about the book is the character growth. You really care about the main character, Kaya. I knew if I thought long enough it would come to me. You really care about Kaya, who they call Marsh Girl, because of all the things that she's been through and her independence and how she just kept going despite everybody hurting her and breaking her heart and leaving her alone. That is what I really loved about the book, is her growth as a person. What fell a little flat for me was the thriller aspect of it. I didn't fully buy into it, and also her growth in her knowledge and of the biology and how that became a career for her despite her lifestyle. I just didn't fully believe that aspect of it. It was hard to, it felt like 2 different stories being told in one. You've got this like really harrowing story of almost historical fiction-y about this girl and her upbringing and who she became as a person, as a character arc. Felt like one story, and then you've got this other story that has to do with her adulthood and her career and love gone wrong and a murder, and that felt like a different story, and that disconnect was very apparent for me from the second half of the novel till the end. So I couldn't give it a full 5 stars, but it was a really good read and I didn't expect it, so 4 stars. Then I listened to The Family Upstairs by Lisa Jewell. Lisa Jewell seems to be a 4-star writer for me. This is a 4-star as well. Maybe that's just how most thrillers go for me, I don't know. Like the one-off 5 stars. It's a story about a woman who inherits a mansion because she's like the last living person. She gets the inheritance, but there's like a lot of weird stuff that happens because when the house was previously occupied, it had like a cult gathering. Like one guy kind of ruled the roost of a bunch of people, and he was more or less like a succubus. Like he came in and he took over their money, and they weren't allowed to like wear shoes or clothes, and they had to eat a very specific like vegan diet, like raw vegan diet that malnourished everybody, and they couldn't have possessions. That whole aspect of it was very cool, very well written. I really enjoyed that part of the storyline. Again, another 2 storylines happening at once. You've got the present day, the girl's got this mansion and she's like, I want to know who I am and why I'm related to these, because she was adopted, and what happened in the house and where'd everyone go and yada yada. Then you've got the past storyline about what really went down in the house, because a lot of people also died. No one knows if it was a murder or like one of those suicides, like drinking the Kool-Aid style. It was very fascinating, and the end was very twisty and turny, and while I was listening to it, I didn't really think ahead to what was happening. I was just enjoying the story. I can't tell you what exactly didn't do it for me, but it just wasn't a full 5 stars for me. That's as much as I can say. Last but not least, this was another pickup that was random. I never really had my eyes on this book until the release of American Dirt by, I can't remember the name of this author, and all of the controversy surrounding a white woman taking the story, the history, the pain of another culture and writing about it and getting Oprah behind it. And if you don't know about all of this, like do a little bit of research about American Dirt, because it's sad. So I saw a bunch of posts about it and a bunch of recommendations of stories that were about Latinx or stories that were written by own voice authors. And so I picked one up, and that is Dominicana by Angie Cruz. This is a story about a girl who is from the Dominican, who is 14 when her parents have set her up. Mostly her mother has set her up with a much older man. She's 14 and I believe he was 32. And they get married and move to New York. That's the whole reason her mother has forced this upon her, because she wants her to have a better life with all of the war that's going on in the Dominican and how dangerous it is, and they don't really have money. So she thinks if she sends her daughter with this other Dominican man to New York to build a life, that they'll make more money and she'll be more successful and happier, and then they can all move up. So she basically puts all of her chickens in one basket with this daughter and says, he's a good man, you're gonna have a good life, send us money, send us money, send us money. She sells her off, basically. And it follows this poor girl who's gone to New York, who doesn't speak English, whose husband is a terrible person, who beats her, rapes her, she gets pregnant. And it's definitely a character-driven story. It's all about Anna, this girl, and having to be this teenager acting as an older woman in a country that she's not familiar with, by herself, with a husband that's never really around. And she tries to like secretly take English classes and secretly do her own business on the side when her husband's not around. And she's lying to her mom back home with letters and calls saying like, yeah, life is good, I will send you money when I have it, things are great. And just trying to like live life at this time and hearing all the bad stuff that's happening back home. It was a hard story to read, it really was. I would recommend it though. It's obviously own voices, so this is much better if you want stories about all the shitty things that happened in this timeline. Something worth checking out. Again, just a harrowing story of immigration for a young girl who's forced into it. And I gave it 4 stars. So that's it for my reading. That is everything I read. As you can see, as I said in the beginning, I'm kind of focusing more on reading what I want to pick up, more like adult focused novels, because I've been having such a bad time with YA and I've been talking about doing this for a long time. I ended the month with 10 5 and 4 stars and only 2 3 stars. So honestly, it worked out It was a great reading month. Pachinko and Normal People were my tops of the month, so I highly recommend you check those two out if they're on your radar or sounded good. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books and what you think of them. If any of these sound interesting to you and you want to pick them up now, I would love to know down below. That's it for me though, guys. Great reading month. February's been okay so far as well, so I'm really looking forward to talking about the books I've read in February. See you in the next one, guys. Like if you like this video, subscribe if you are new here and would like to see more content from me. I post all my social media links down below. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram and Goodreads. I will start Contemporary-a-thon on Monday, so my TBR will be coming up soon. I don't know how much reading I'll get done between now and then because it is my birthday weekend. Another year older. Time flies, guys. All right, I'm gonna go. I will see you in the next one. Hope you're having a great week. Bye.